Welcome to Salon Talks. I'm Amanda Marcotte, and my guest today is Wayne Kramer. He is one of the founding members of the MC5, and he is the author of The Hard Stuff, Dope, Crime, the MC5, and My Life of Impossibilities. Welcome to Salon Talks, Wayne.
Thanks. Happy to be here. I'm a big fan of Salon. Kind of a thrill for me.
Well, it's a thrill for us, too. So the MC5 came to prominence in the late 60s and garnered legendary status for playing outside the 1968 Democratic Convention at a show that devolved into a riot. That was, a hugely stressful time in American history, and I want to ask you, do you see parallels between then and now, and how so?
I do. It's not the same. The things that, the baby boomers achieved in my generation in the 60s, ending the war in Vietnam, moving civil rights forward, addressing outdated sexual mores, this kind of 50s sexuality, marijuana. Those things are different today. But you're right, there are some disturbing parallels. We have a wretched grifter in the Oval Office who has utter contempt for the rule of law, and it tries to manipulate the political process to his own ends, very much like Richard Nixon. We have corruption that's stunning in its width and breadth of, from the high offices of Congress down to the local dog catcher. The corruption that exists in the establishment is mind-boggling. You really clock it, and we have a war ongoing for 17 years in the Middle East against people that actually are no threat to the United States of America. We have a completely incoherent policy. I mean, this is exactly what Dwight Eisenhower warned us about, this military-industrial complex of politicians, generals, and arms manufacturers that if encouraged and allowed to be left to their own devices, would create perpetual war. And so we have that going on as well. So on one hand, I think, you've probably heard that this idea of the American politics swings 5 degrees to the left, to the right. And we swung over to the left with the election of Barack Obama, who, was a constitutional scholar. He lived around the world. He was a wise man, and he knew how to govern, and he was about public service. And then we swung the other direction, and the pendulum broke off the clock, and the clock was smashed on the floor, and we ended up with this developer that we have. So at this point, I'm just looking for the swing back.
Well, maybe in a few months.
Yes, there's still hope.
And that's an interesting question. You bring up the war in Afghanistan. I feel like, your generation, the Vietnam War was like this extremely pressing issue in politics constantly, and it drove a lot of your activism in the 60s. Why do you think that is on such a back burner now?
Well, conscription is probably the answer to that question, because young men were required to join the military and go off to fight and die. And most Americans of my generation could not justify what was happening in Vietnam. I mean, that's why there were hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating. That's why it stopped, because it was a military adventure that went sideways, and a perfect storm where everything went wrong, and we just, sent more young people over there to the tragic end of, over 50,000 young Americans lost their lives over there for no reason in the end. We can look back in history now and we can see clearly. And I'm not dogging the warriors. These were guys that believed in what they were doing. They made the ultimate sacrifice. And, you know, how we treated them has been horrific. You know, the Vietnam vets, I live in Los Angeles, and, you know, it seems like half the people that live outdoors are Vietnam vets. So today, there's no conscription, and the American public is not being charged for this war. They're not even paying for it. They have no skin in the game. We're charging our kids for this war. So everybody kind of, let's go to the mall, man. Have you got a new iPhone? It doesn't affect them. You know, these are like a lot of rural families that, you know, their children go, or families that have generations of military people, they go. And young men will always want to go to war. You know, I used to think it had something to do with politics. It doesn't. This is an ancient ritual for young men to see if can I go walk through the fire? Can I do this? And you know, young guys go over there, and of course we know they come back profoundly damaged. They commit suicide at a horrific rate, and you know, there's no coherent policy as to why we do this.
Yeah. So you struggled, in your new memoir, you write about this, you struggled with drug addiction for a long time. And during an era when there was a lot, often I think not as much sympathy for people with addictions, as I think now there's a little bit more awareness of how it's a disease and a little bit more sympathy. So I want to ask you how you think, especially in this present moment, we can move forward better to help more people that have this problem.
Well, decriminalization would be the first step, you know, to remove this from a police issue at all. This is not a justice crime issue. This is a medical, psychological problem. If we look at the model that the Swiss have instituted, 20 years ago, the Swiss had a horrific opiate problem. Tourists couldn't go to a city park in cities in Switzerland because the junkies were all nodding out, puking, shooting up in the middle of the day. And the Swiss, being the conservative, focused people that they are, said, we got to do something about this. Let's call some experts in. They called the experts in. The experts said, legalize this, control it, put it in a clinic, make treatment available on demand. So they did. Today, there is no heroin problem in Switzerland. They have legal clinics where people that are addicted to opiates can go and get the medication they need every day. The average stay in those clinics is 3 years. In the first year, they stabilize their medical addiction. By the second year, they can get a job, they can get a boyfriend or a girlfriend, they can start to have friendships, they can start to show up for real life. By the third year, going to the clinic every day is a big pain in the ass. They want to get done with it. Yeah. This could work in this country. If this was focused on harm reduction and treatment, we could find a reasonable and successful policy for addiction. We haven't got there yet. I mean, the war on drugs, the drug prohibition has killed more people than drugs ever could, and destroyed more families. I mean, in America today, we have 2.3 million of our citizens under lock and key, in prison. And I'm an archetypal drug war prisoner. I served a prison term in the 1970s for a nonviolent drug offense. I think it's the greatest failure of social policy in America's domestic history.
And I think you've been speaking out about this issue, and it's an issue that I feel you're starting to hear more people talk about in the public discourse. You're even seeing both Democrats and Republicans, a few handful of Republicans even start to say, we should do more to reduce mass incarceration and get people back to real life. Do you feel optimistic that this is possible in the future, soon?
Yeah, my attitude is people made this mess, and if people made the mess, people can fix the mess. But we're up against a formidable challenge. First, this is a gigantic business hit.
Yeah.
People say the prison system's broken. It's not broken. It's a big hit. It's a huge success. It's a $90 billion a year industry. So that's a tough one in our fine capitalist world that we live in. That's a tough one to undo. So I'm suspicious of the Koch brothers and others that on the right that champion rehabilitation, reentry, repurposing justice dollars. Those are all good things, and they need to happen. But what they do is they might cut a break to the non-serious offender, the non-violent offender, the non-sexual offender, and they want to reduce those sentences. But while they're reducing those people's sentences, the serious offender, the sex offender, the violent offender, their sentences go up. So really, this has so far just been a whack-a-mole kind of thing. And the worst part of it is that no matter what changes we make, and if we do succeed in reducing, making sentencing more sensible, and lower our prison population, that's just clearing out cell space for immigrants. And they want to keep those jails full and keep those prisons full because they make just as much money on immigrants, and immigrants have no rights. You and I go to prison, we still have habeas corpus, we can talk to the press, we can talk to our families, we can have an attorney. Immigrants have none of that. So I'm a little skeptical when I hear the Koch brothers talking about prison reform, because really underneath it all, what they really want is there's a couple aspects of the white-collar crime laws that they want to undo to further their own economic benefit.
This is an important warning. I could talk about this all day with you, but we should ask about music and
Sure.
about the MC5.
Sure.
It seems to me in the 60s, especially, music was very central to progressive organizing. You guys were huge on the left. There was a lot of rock bands that were talking about the war and about social progress. R&B bands were central to the civil rights movement. What do you think music can add to social justice movements? Why is it so important?
It's our drum beat. You know, it's this tribe over here beats the drums, and they tell the tribe over there what's happening in their neighborhood. In the songs, a community is formed. If you have a Bob Dylan song that's really, it just kills you, and I love that song too, we meet in that song. There's a unity for us in that song. And that's the role that music has traditionally played in political change and social change. You know, we're the messengers, we're the, we sound the alarm. We're Paul Revere riding through the neighborhood, clang, 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 the fascists are coming, the fascists are coming. And we inspire people, hopefully. You know, we energize them to go out and get involved in the process of democracy.
And you know, I think that's been ongoing since then, but do you have advice to young people that want to sort of combine music and politics in this way?
Well, yeah, I'd say start where you are. You know, start in your family. Start at the dinner table. See if you can convince somebody to see things your way using reason, logic, facts, the truth. Start with your friends. Can you have a conversation with them about something that's important to you in your neighborhood? In your city, you know, are you involved in local elections? Do you know who your local judges are? Do you know who your representatives are? Do you know how they feel about things? Do you agree with them? If you don't agree with them, elect somebody else. You know, get involved. I mean, democracy is not a concept or a word or a thing to talk about. It's a thing to do. And I don't mean hitting a like on your computer. I mean, getting your ass up off the couch and go out and meet some people and get organized and take action that affects the world around us, that affects our communities and our states and our nation and our civilization.
I mean, I think, you know, one good thing of Donald Trump's election was that you actually see people in the streets so much these days. I mean, do you think that helps?
I'm not sure. I mean, look at right after he was elected, the Women's March. That was unprecedented in history. That was a massive demonstration. Didn't affect Trump. He didn't pay any attention to it. Didn't move him 1 degree. And I think the authorities have learned the lessons of the 60s as far as street demonstrations go. They can handle it. They control it. They control the news. You know, when the the war in Iraq was gearing up, the LA Times said there were 30,000 people in the street. I was out there. There were 300,000 people in the street. And I'm not saying that there's a conspiracy and the newspapers are working with the government. I'm just saying that the police and the government can handle street demonstrations. Yeah, I mean, I marched I joined Rage Against the Machine for a performance of Kick Out the Jams at the Democratic Convention 10 years ago in Denver. And we had a march, and all these, with a bunch of GIs, you know, veterans and regular people, and they had a marching route for us. And they routed us right through the industrial section of town where nobody lived, and we're marching, and everybody's shouting, and they got their phrases, hell no, we don't, and you know, these are our brothers, these are our sisters, we're resistors, and there's nobody, we're just hearing it for ourselves, and they march us all around town through these industrial neighborhoods, and then they finally dump us out in a football field that's completely fenced in.
Yeah.
So they know how to handle street demonstrations. You know, I think they're not negative. They don't hurt anything. It's good for people to go and demonstrate in these kinds of. I think that recent event in D.C. where the white nationalists were going to have their this year's whatever they call it, Unite the Right, and then like 10,000 people came out to oppose it. That was pretty good. I like that because that was very focused and that carried a clear message. But in general, I think we have to find some other routes to bring pressure on legislators, on political people. I mean, this is Saul Alinsky 101, you know.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I feel like, yeah, obviously back in the 60s, it rattled Nixon, it rattled Johnson.
Yeah, it was a big thing to see, you know, 100,000, 200,000 people marching in Washington or in Detroit, or, I mean, they were, and it was meaningful. I think they can handle it these days. I don't think it shakes them that much. You can shake them in a vote much better, much more effectively.
So I guess I have one last question for you. You joined. I have so many questions for you, but let's just end with this one. So much great rock music from the 60s and 70s comes from the Midwest. You guys in the MC5, the Stooges, Diva is one of my favorite bands of all time.
Mine too. Yeah.
Why do you think the Michigan, Ohio area was such a hotbed of musical innovation at that time?
Because we weren't hip, we weren't cool. You know, the industrial Midwest, like nothing cool could happen in, you know, in Akron, Ohio, or Detroit, Michigan. I mean, they make cars there. And my sense was the things we were exposed to, the music that inspired us, the free jazz movement, the music of John Coltrane and Sun Ra, and for me to try to do what those guys were doing with electric guitars and this rock band, we felt like, geez, our ideas are as good as anybody else's ideas, maybe even better, maybe even more stretched out than the stuff I'm hearing from the West Coast or from New York or from London. And because we were kind of, the world kind of looked down on us, it gave us an attitude. And so we pushed harder. We became more, you know, assertive or aggressive even, and we had to fight a little harder to make some noise and be part of the conversation. I mean, it's like, you know, like anytime if you have a 5-year-old, as I do, and you tell him don't do that, the first thing he's going to do is do it harder. You know, it's limit testing.
Well, thank you so much, Wayne. This is Wayne Kramer of the MC5, and the book is called The Hard Stuff: Dope, Crime, the MC5, and My Life of Impossibilities. And if you go to MC50th.com/contest, you can enter for a chance to win collector's items from the band and tickets to their 50th anniversary tour. Thank you again for joining us.
You're so welcome. I really appreciate it. I'm a big fan.